Today we're going to be talking about my great aunt's husband's aunt, or my mum's cousin's great aunt, and her name was Cesca Trench, or Sadbh Trinseach. Now, even though this family tree is technically part of my family tree, it is so complicated. Not only was there a lot of marrying cousins, but there was a lot of recycling of names. So let's have a go. Francis Trench had a brother called Richard Trench, and Richard had a son called Richard Chenevix Trench, who became Most Reverend Richard Chenevix Trench, who married Francis Trench's daughter, Frances Mary Trench, and they were cousins, and they had Reverend Herbert Francis Chenevix Trench, who married his cousin, Isabella Catherine Trench. And between those cousins, Isabella and Herbert, they had Frances Georgiana Chenevix Trench, who was shortened to Cesca Trench. And then later in life, because of her Irish affiliations and her Irish identity, she became Sadbh Trinseach. But she was actually born in England. She was born in Liverpool on the 3rd of February 1891 to a unionist family. And that means that her family believed that Ireland and England should be part of one union, so that they wanted the United Kingdom to include Ireland. However, her mother, Isabella, did describe her children as Irish. And Cesca would definitely take that to its full meaning. Cesca went to school, firstly in Switzerland, because they didn't have very much money, so they basically just had to live wherever their family were. And then she went to school in Malvern in England. And although she was very much encouraged for her artistic skills because she was very good at painting and drawing, she found that her sympathies for the Irish people didn't really sit well with her classmates. And one of the people who was quite critical of her was her cousin Elizabeth Bowen, yes, the famous author. She would criticize Cesca and her sister Margot for being embarrassing because they had peasant dresses, or kind of this Celtic style of dress. However, we can kind of ignore Elizabeth's opinion somewhat, because she would go on to kind of embarrass her family with affairs and also sort of disparagingly try to expose the bitter kernel of the principles at the heart of the upper middle class way of existing. So we can kind of see that she's disenchanted in the way that Cesca and Margot were when she was younger. Just she's a bit late to the game. Cesca had another cousin who was very encouraging of her Irish sympathies, and that was Dermot. And Dermot taught her and Margot how to speak Irish, but also encouraged them to join the London branch of the Gaelic League. So these are people in London who are supporting the Irish nationalistic cause and encouraging the Irish people to get their culture back, get their language back, and get political emancipation from the UK. Now, I'm going to take a slight detour here because Dermot Chenevix Trench was so interesting. So yes, he was a nationalist, and yes, he was the one who was teaching Cesca how to speak Irish. But we're going to go away from politics for a second because there's such a fascinating story that goes on with him. So all along the Irish coast are these towers called Mortello Towers, and famously one of them housed James Joyce. Yes, that James Joyce, the big old writer. Now in 1904, Joyce had a mutual friend with Dermot Chenevix Trench, and so Dermot was staying there with his friend, and chaos ensued. If you've read Ulysses, firstly, congratulations, it is so long and very complicated, but secondly, remember that nightmare sequence about the Black Panther? Well, it's actually based on a real event. Dermot got horrendously drunk one night, and he was kind of hallucinating because he was so out of it, and he thought that a cooking pot was some kind of aggressive beast. So he shot at it. That's the actual event behind Haines having the Black Panther nightmare in the Ulysses book. Dermot Chenevix Trench is the inspiration for the Haines character in Ulysses. How cool is that? The person teaching Chenevix Trench Irish and the nationalistic course, which becomes one of her most identifying qualities in history, is also the person who's inspiring one of the wildest characters in Irish literature. He's so cool. Anyway, we'll go back to Cesca, but I just thought I would mention that. She's excitedly learning Irish, and in 1908 she joins the Gaelic League and she's speaking Irish, and she starts to sign her artworks ST for Sadbh Trinseach. She'd been introduced to the arts by her aunt's husband, Samuel Henry Butcher, who was a conservative and on the other end of the political spectrum, but really introduced her to all the right people and got her interest in the art world going. Then in 1910 he passed away, and he left a lot of money to Cesca, and Cesca could suddenly travel. So in 1911 she got to explore the world a bit. She went to Calcutta and ended up staying with a family relative who was the Bishop of Calcutta and definitely did not agree with her political views, but she found that she really enjoyed traveling and she loved meeting new people. She was extremely open-minded and a big explorer. She was in Calcutta from December 1911 to April 1912, and then in 1912 she returned to Europe, where she began to study at art school in Paris. She went to art school in Paris between 1912 and 1914, and she found that not only did she really flourish as an artist, but her social circles were becoming much more varied. She really connected with the Czechs and Poles who were there and how they experienced nationalistic oppression. In 1914, she then started going to art school in Dublin at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Arts. And this is where she started to use her artistic skills to support the nationalistic cause that she believed in. She was making posters and flyers and pamphlets that supported the nationalistic cause and encouraged people to have more of a Celtic dress or use the Celtic language. Her cousin Dermot Tenevix-Trench had actually written a 32-page pamphlet called "What is the Use in Reviving Irish?" And it encouraged not only the use of Irish language, but also in staying in Ireland to have a career and a life there. At the time, 38.8% of the citizens lived in Canada, America, Australia, or England. And there was this idea that if you got a good education, you went to England, and if you didn't really, you went to Canada, Australia, or America. And he was really fighting for a cause to reinvigorate the Irish population. They'd had their culture and their language and their land taken over. And Cesca also started a campaign with her sister to get signatures so that the Irish taxes would stay in the Irish treasury. At the time, the UK was taking all of the taxes from the Irish government and from the Irish people and amalgamating it into their tax resources as part of the British Empire. She was making a political campaign to fight this. And of course, that required artistic posters to go with them. However, that's not where she stopped. In 1914, she's doing all this artwork to propagate the cause that she believes in, and then she joins Cumann Mán, which is the women's auxiliary force of Sinn Féin. So these are the ladies who are fighting the nationalistic cause, and I really do mean fighting. They were getting involved in gaining supplies and couriering these supplies in different places. These are the people who taught Sadbh first aid so that she could support during a rebellion. And that rebellion came in 1916. The Easter Rising of Dublin was an explosive war between the nationalists and the Unionists. So the nationalists were the people who were looking for home rule, so that the Irish could rule the Irish. They could keep their own taxes, they could look after themselves, and they could rule themselves. And the Unionists were saying, no, let the UK do that. Stay part of the UK. This explosive war was happening in the city, and she was right there involved in it. She was couriering aid to the General Post Office, which was the headquarters of the Fenians. And she was also trying to support the garrison that was at St. Stephen's Green. This was all-out war, and she was being incredibly brave. Guns were going off everywhere, and she did end up getting arrested. However, she was released basically due to the fact that she was related to the Bishop of Dublin. Even after the Easter Rising, she joined the Irish National Aid Association to support those who'd been arrested for their participation in the Easter Rising or their association with Sinn Féin or the Fenians. Those men, mostly, those people had dependents at home who often couldn't provide for themselves, people like women and children or sick parents who needed support, and there suddenly wasn't anyone there when that person had been arrested. So the Irish National Aid Association would go in and give them medical support or the supplies that they needed to survive. She was supporting herself through her artistic work, and she was actually painting a mural for an Irish college in County Clare when Eamon de Valera was finally elected, and she was elated. And it wasn't long before more happy news followed. On the 17th of April 1918, she married Diarmuid Coffey, who'd also been part of the nationalistic forces. He was less of a separatist than her, and he didn't really support the suffragists, which she definitely was. She was very liberal as a feminist, which was great. I support that thoroughly. But he was a bit weak on that front. But they had a happy marriage and they could really openly talk about their political views, their questioning of religion. They had this beautiful open-minded perspective at home. However, their happy marriage in Dublin didn't last long. She died of Spanish flu on the 30th of October 1918. However, there is a small sweetness that I would like to share with you. Diarmaid did remarry, and his second wife really treasured all of Sadbh Trinseach's paintings and drawings, and she gave them all to the National Gallery of Ireland. Diarmaid bequeathed all of Sadbh Trinseach's papers to his daughter, who then gave them to the National Library of Ireland. And his daughter's name was Sadbh.